Hi there, folks. This is your Serial Cynic. I'm back here with another video. After doing some research over some time here, let me grab my microphone so I can make it easier on you guys than to have it making a bunch of noise in your ears. But I'm going to give some thanks to the Hebrew Israelites. As you know, I've done quite a few videos on them, and I will give credit where credit is due, in that they drove me to go back to reading up on the continent of Africa and its history. I went out trying to track down these various people or tribes that they say are Israelites. And I never denied it in my video. I've always said that quite plausible, quite possible, that the people who inhabited the ancient land of Canaan that came to be known as the Israelites or the Hebrews, I guess prior to being called the Israelites, and eventually the Jews, that it was quite plausible that many of them ended up on the continent of Africa. Now, we do know that during the invasion by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, according to the Bible, which, I take that with a grain of salt, but again, very plausible. We read there that people like the prophet Jeremiah, should he have existed, ended up fleeing to Egypt. Again, I keep using the word plausible because in terms of proximity, the African continent in relation to the ancient land of Israel are right next to one another. So if you're fleeing an invading army, naturally, Africa is a place that you could escape to. But more so, it was during the invasion of Titus in 70 CE, when Titus the Roman, he would become an emperor, but at the time he was just a general. When he invaded the land of Judea, he basically exiled, I think it was 50,000 or more Jews over to North Africa in what was called Carthage at the time, which today is Tunisia, if I'm not mistaken. He exiled a whole bunch of them over there into northern Africa. Now, these people did not just fall off the face of the earth or fall off the pages of history. They went on to migrate to other parts of Africa. Some of them, I guess, founded cities, empires, clans, and migrated into other parts of Africa. So we have other written records of Jews or people leaving the land of Israel and going into other parts of Africa, like Northeast Africa and so forth. Of course, there's a story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. There's some legend there. Lots of it may not be true, but again, very plausible that you have people just going back and forth from Africa into Israel and from Israel down into Africa. So I never denied that part. The only thing I was complaining about, or my gripes were, is the fact or the statement that is passed off as fact that all black people on this side of the world, being that you're not from continental Africa, so to speak, even though these Hebrew Israelites who came over during slavery, allegedly, were continental Africans. That's where they were born. But I'm talking about people supposedly born in Africa who were not Hebrew Israelites, so to speak. The argument is made by the Hebrew Israelites that all Negroes on this side of the world are descendants of Hebrew Israelites. That's something that I tend to argue about, or I would debate. Because after reading through a lot of the history of West Africa, I come to realize that it was much more of a complicated mess than a very defined line as to say, these people over here are what we call Hamitic Africans, and these people over here are Shemite Africans. It was very hard. Yes, I've read accounts where it looks like certain people were singled out to be sold into slavery. But again, it was a complicated mess because a lot of times, in some cases, some of the people who were doing the enslaving ended up in slavery themselves. There were situations where some of these slavers, these African slave traders, if you want to call them Hamites or whatever you may want to call them, they themselves ended up being tricked and being dragged away into slavery themselves. So that is one example of quote unquote Hamitic Africans ending up in slavery and coming over onto this side of the world. So to go around and say, well, hey, I'm a Shemite African, I am a Hebrew Israelite, it's not that easy to go ahead and figure out who is who per se. Maybe some of us are lucky enough to trace back our roots to Africa and find out that, yeah, your great, 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 great grandfather was a great, 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 great grandchild of Hezekiah from Israel or something like that. Great. But not all of us can do that. Okay? Well, one of the things in doing my research that I came up on, something that I knew, but I never put the two together, is the fact that what turned out, or what seemed like it was a good thing initially, opened the doors for a very bad thing. And what am I talking about? Well, what was it? In 1803, if I am not mistaken, I think that's when England banned the slave trade, at least in their empire. And as a result, they went ahead and started pressuring other European nations to do likewise. And one of the things that England did, because they were the naval power of the day, they basically started to patrol the west coast of Africa, or the area known as the Slave Coast, which would be what we would call today Nigeria, Ghana, Benin, back in those days, Dahomey. They began to patrol those areas. And they would patrol to see if there were any ships trying to sneak in and sneak out enslaved Africans. So what they would do is when they would capture these ships, they will disembark the enslaved Africans, put them on their ship, and bring them back to Africa. I guess punishing those who were still engaging in the slave trade. But one of the things that they did, or one of the places where they began to resettle a lot of these Africans, so basically you could put it this way. You had enslaved Africans who could have left out of Ghana, what we call Ghana today. And when the British resettled them back in Africa after freeing them from these ships that were still illegally trading human beings, they would bring them back and they settled them in what we call today Sierra Leone, and what became the town of Freetown. The name suggests basically what it was really all about. So you had a bunch of enslaved Africans from other parts of Africa, well, of course, in the same region, but from other tribes and other areas, now moving in to another location in Africa where there were people living there already, other tribes. This caused a certain amount of tension. Now, a lot of these enslaved Africans who were freed by the British, a lot of them adopted Christianity. Meanwhile, on the African continent, you still had a lot of Africans who were Muslims and a lot of Africans who were still holding on to their ancient tribal religions. So now when you have these people who are now free moving into Sierra Leone, tension began to rise and there were some issues and problems. Now the British, being that these people were their responsibility, or they were the ones who brought them there, these free people would reach out to them and appeal to the British for protection or to help them out to settle matters of dispute or whatever was going on there. So, initially, the Europeans, even during the era of slavery, they pretty much kind of stayed along the coast, built their forts on the coast, and basically let their African middlemen go into the interior and do their dirty work for them, which is kidnapping and capturing Africans for the slave trade. So the Europeans more or less stayed along the coastline. This is not to say that you didn't have some of them who did not venture into or beyond the coast to go and do some kidnappings themselves. But for the most part, they had their African middlemen to do their dirty work. Well, with these new freed people being resettled in places like Sierra Leone, in Freetown, when the issues started to arise, they started to appeal to the British. The British now started to get a little bit more involved, coming in on land, getting a little bit more involved, going a little deeper in, a little further in, and a little further into the land. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution started booming off in England. So now, because you have the Industrial Revolution going on, now you need certain things to keep this machine going. So, with slavery dying out, phone is telling me something here, I just had to pay attention to it. Anyway, so with slavery dying out now and becoming a thing of the past, and the Industrial Revolution taking over, now instead of sugar dominating and the need for slaves over there, now England is talking about back home, money is being made through the Industrial Revolution. Now you need certain minerals, now you need certain things to fuel this thing. And it became evident to them that Africa was rich in a lot of these things that they needed. So as they started to go in to help out the people that they resettled, it started to become evident to them that the land of Africa, the continent, was rather rich. So now it became somewhat expedient to them to start setting up some business dealings, doing a couple of things here and there, and before you know it, they were having a bigger foothold in places like Sierra Leone. So now it's not just along the coast anymore. And before you know it, they started making colonies of these areas and started to put their foot down, started to put their stamp down, started to take over areas. And thus, eventually what soon followed after was the carving up of the African continent by various European powers. Down there fleecing the continent of its resources to benefit their people back home and to enrich themselves. So now, instead of taking Africans from Africa and bringing them over to this side of the world to put them to work in cotton fields and cane fields and tobacco fields, now it was, let's go down to Africa and technically enslave the people on their own continent and make them work for us and make us rich. So what turned out to be, or what started out to be a good thing, hey, you know what? We have a moral conscience now. Slavery is a bad thing. Let's end it. Let's end the slave trade. Let's go ahead out there and do something about it by stopping ships from bringing enslaved Africans from Africa over to the Americas. Let's stop it. And when we get these people off these ships, since we don't really know where they came from, we'll just find a spot on the continent that we'll carve out and put them back over there so they can go back on with their lives. But in doing so, it opened the doors for further encroachment by the Europeans, starting with the British. Excuse me. And thus, it opened up the door for the carving up, or the race for Africa as it was called, to carve it up, fleece, pit the people against one another, create unnatural borders, place hostile tribes next to one another, divide and conquer them, exploited them, so that by the time the Europeans pulled out, Africa was a mess. Started, of course, with slavery, completely destabilizing the region, and then going in colonizing the place and creating further destabilization, which leaves us, or which left the continent in the way that it was, that it's still recovering to this very day. Anyway, I suggest that you guys look into this for yourselves. It's pretty fascinating and pretty interesting. But for right now, I'm here gagging, so I'll end this video right now. And again, I want to thank my Hebrew Israelite friends out there for their comments and everything that then led me to going back to rereading my African history and catching up on things and getting a better perspective. Anyway, until the next video, you guys take care.